Your brain is changing right now, but is it getting better or is it getting worse? And I'm not just talking about your age or even your genes. No, most of it has to do with what you did today, what you ate, how you slept, what you looked at, how much you moved, and so on. Because dementia isn't something that suddenly happens to you. It's something that develops slowly, silently, one daily habit at a time. Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about 10 habits that damage your brain and silently accelerate your dementia. And number one is type 3 diabetes. And when we say that, we're talking about Alzheimer's dementia as a metabolic disease because there's such a close connection between metabolic disease and Alzheimer's dementia. And sugar is at the core of it, but there's so much more than that. It's the overconsumption of sugar and processed foods that usually go hand in hand. And because they are very addictive and because these foods are depleted from nutrients, we tend to overeat. And whenever we overeat over a period of time, we develop insulin resistance, which is metabolic disease. And there's several different mechanisms. The first one is that when the brain becomes insulin resistant along with the rest of the body, then we can have a lot of blood sugar floating around in the bloodstream. But because the cells are insulin resistant, they don't receive that blood sugar. So we're basically starving the brain in the midst of plenty. Another one is AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. And with those, the glucose cross-links with proteins and they form molecules that are damaged and are not supposed to be there and that damage the brain tissue. Also, with insulin resistance, we tend to develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and visceral fat. And when the liver becomes very fatty and insulin resistant as a result, then it produces more cytokines, more inflammatory messengers, and they get out in circulation and they cross the blood-brain barrier. So now we increase neuroinflammation as well and do damage that way. And it's primarily the fructose in the sugar that drives this formation of liver fat. And then as a result, what they have found is significant hippocampal impairment. And hippocampus is a structure in the brain that's part of the limbic system. And the hippocampus has a lot to do with memory. It is where we turn short-term memory into long-term memory. And we also process spatial awareness. So in terms of finding our way through a maze or around our house or finding our way back to things, that has a lot to do with the hippocampus. And it also has a lot to do with memory in general and with emotional regulation. Number two is low-fat diets, and they usually go hand in hand with low cholesterol diets. So what cholesterol does is the brain is 60% fat by dry weight. If we take out the water, 60% of the rest of it is fat. And a very significant portion of that is cholesterol. And the cholesterol is absolutely necessary for forming membranes, all the cell membranes in all the body, but especially in the brain, and the myelin, which is the waxy coating of your nerves that acts as insulation and allows the body to send electrical messages precisely and quickly. And cholesterol is also the precursor for hormones. So all of our steroid hormones like cortisol and testosterone and estrogen are using cholesterol as a raw material, but also some of the neurosteroids, some of the hormones inside the brain that it uses to communicate internally are made of cholesterol. So with low cholesterol in the diet, the body does have the ability to produce some of it, but there's still a good chance that it doesn't have enough and the production of some of these brain components suffer. So when people have a fat phobia and they try to cut back on fat on purpose, now what happens? They go low fat and they have to eat more of something else. And that typically becomes carbohydrates. So if we think about it, typically we're going to have about 20% of our calories from protein. It might be a little more, a little less, but roughly 20%. And that means the other 80% come from fat and carbohydrates. And I think that a healthy ratio, if we eat whole food and healthy fats and grass-fed meats and vegetables and so forth, we're probably going to end up with about 60% of our calories from fat and 20% of our calories from carbohydrates. And I think that 20% is on the upper end for most people. If you're an athlete, you can probably go a little higher. If you're younger, you could go a little higher. And if you're trying to reverse metabolic disease, then it should probably be less than 20%. But when people try to go low fat, they usually turn it the other way around. And they end up with 20% of calories from fat and 60% from carbohydrate, which is pretty much what is officially recommended and which is part of why we have this epidemic of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic disease. The third habit is to eat too many grains, have a high grain diet. And what we just talked about, grains, of course, will also drive, number one, insulin resistance, because grains will spike blood sugar tremendously and they are a high carb food. But another factor we need to consider for the brain is that grains contain gluten and lectin, especially wheat. And those two molecules will degrade. They'll break down the tight junctions in your gut. So you have a lining on your intestines that are supposed to very, very selectively let things through. And if we damage those junctions, now all sorts of things can get through that are not supposed to. Another word for this is leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So what happens now is we have some bacteria that produce things like lipopolysaccharides, which are little fragments of bacteria. And they leak out and they get into the bloodstream now because of this leaky gut. And these, once they get in the bloodstream, they can be small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. And these LPSs, they're very irritating. They stimulate our immune system to respond and produce inflammation. So now in the brain, of course, we end up with neuroinflammation. And this is just one example with the LPSs. We have to remember that there's the saying, leaky gut equals leaky brain. So there's several mechanisms by which if we have a gut problem, we end up with a brain problem. The fourth habit that can accelerate your dementia and damage the brain is a high omega-6 load. And why this matters for the brain is that there's this fatty acid, part of fish oil, called DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, that is critical for the formation of cell membranes. It's the most important fatty acid for the structure of a brain cell. But what happens with too many omega-6s is they will compete with the DHA, because they're both fatty acids. They look sort of similar. And when the brain makes a new cell membrane, if there's too much omega-6 around, then it's going to be included in that cell membrane instead of the DHA. And when we look at our ancestors based on their diet, based on the foods available, then the ratio that they had of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, which is DHA is an omega-3, then they were about a 1-to-1 or maybe a 4-to-1 with 4 times as much omega-6 as omega-3 or DHA. And that's about the upper limit. But today, when we look around the world, what we see is a 20-to-1. People have 20 times more omega-6 or as high as 40 times as much omega-6 as omega-3 and DHA. And the reason is that we eat all sorts of things that our ancestors didn't have. We've been the same, according to our DNA, for about 250,000 years. And yet, only in the last 50 years, we've had an abundance, an explosion of seed oils, of processed foods that are going to include these seed oils. So we're talking about canola oil and soybean oil and corn oil and safflower oil. All these things being sold as vegetable oils. And then they're being used in the processed food as well. And restaurants will cook almost exclusively with these vegetable oils or seed oils. And now when we also eat grain-fed meat and grain-fed dairy, when all the cattle have been fed grain, soy and corn, now they're going to produce milk and cream and cheese, and all the other dairy products are going to have those same high ratios of omega-6s to omega-3s. And what happens now with the cell membrane is that with a too high a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, we get rigid and stiff membranes. So all the fats that are included in the cell membranes, which includes cholesterol and omega-3s, there's a very delicate balance for that cell membrane to get just the right balance between flexibility and rigidity so that it can allow the right things in and it can send the proper signals and receive the proper signals. But with a really high ratio, what happens is we get an increase in neuroinflammation and we also get degraded neuronal membranes and communication. And the fifth bad habit is to eat all the time. We've been told to eat at least 3 times a day with snacks in between. And on top of that, a lot of people will walk around with a bag of nuts or a sippy cup with sweet coffee or a soda or something. So they're basically going the entire day and they could have 15, 20 blood sugar spikes and insulin spikes throughout the day. And why this matters for the brain is because of clearing out waste. We have like a cleanup crew in the brain that's different from the rest of the body. That's called the glymphatic system, which is a combination of 2 words, glial cells and lymphatic. So the rest of the body has the lymphatic system to clean things up. But the brain doesn't have anything like that. It doesn't have the lymphatic system. It has something called CSF, which is cerebrospinal fluid, which circulates much, much less and much slower than the body's lymphatic system. And instead of the regular immune cells, it has something called glial cells to assist and support the brain cells. But it's a much more limited cleanup system than the rest of the body. And it depends on 2 things. It depends on fasting and deep sleep. And during fasting, we clean up inside the cells with a process called autophagy or self-eating. But with snacking and with constant insulin spikes, that shuts down that autophagy completely, and we're also shutting down that cleanup crew. And if we don't get the proper cleanup inside the cells, now we have buildup of certain waste products called amyloid beta, which is a waste protein. It's a misfolded protein that forms plaques and is associated with dementia and Alzheimer's. We also have something called tau tangles, which is another type of misfolded protein, and also other metabolic waste will start accumulating. So for hundreds of thousands of years, the brain has had these built-in cleaning cycles. But in modern days, with snacking, we never allow these cleaning cycles to run properly. So our ancestors might have had 1 or 2 insulin spikes, 1 or 2 meals per day. Today, with snacks and meals, we might have 6 or up to 15 with people eating nuts and candy out of bowls, and there's vending machines around every corner, and we have our sippy cups to drink on. Now, we have to realize that that is very destructive for the brain. And autophagy is step 1 of 2 steps in this glymphatic system, of this cleanup system. And it's the thing that happens inside the neurons, inside the brain cells. Which brings us to number 6, which is poor sleep. Because during deep sleep, that's the other thing, that's step 2 in this glymphatic system. It's where we can clean up extracellular, outside the brain cells. So it's during deep sleep. It's usually in the early part of the night where our brain slows way, way, way down, and we get down to brain frequencies between 1 and 4 hertz. So when we're awake, we have brain frequencies in the 20s and the high teens and the 20s up to 30s. Then when we're very relaxed, like a meditative state, we could be down in around 10. But deep sleep is between 1 and 4, and it's a very limited period during the night. But that deep sleep that slow frequency activates this glymphatic system. And now we have glial cells. They are the supporting brain cells, or cells supporting brain cells rather. And this particular kind is called astrocytes. It's a type of glial cell. And what happens during this deep sleep is they shrink. They get up to 60% smaller. And what happens now when these astrocytes shrink and there's all this room between the cells is that we get a dramatic increase in the flow of CSF, of cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the equivalent of the rest of the body's lymphatic system. But again, it only works really well during deep sleep. And what it does now, it can wash away the debris that has accumulated. So first we have the autophagy from fasting that goes on inside the cell, that cleans out the debris inside. And then now it's outside the cell and the CSF can wash it away. So we're talking about this amyloid beta and these tau tangles that are specifically associated with dementia, but also, like I said, other metabolic waste. And when it comes to sleep, I want to mention this, and we'll come back to it, but blue light, artificial light from screens will increase cortisol, which will interfere with sleep very effectively. So we really want to start thinking about sleep as precious and even sacred. I remember back in college, which was about 40 years ago now, that they didn't really know why we slept. There was very little evidence and actual knowledge. They knew that you didn't feel good, you got really tired, you could get schizophrenic after so many days without sleep, but they really didn't have an idea of why we sleep, what's the function. And now we know that yes, we needed to consolidate our memories, but the biggest thing is probably what I just went over, that if we can't sleep properly, if we can't get into that deep sleep stage, we can't clean our brains properly. And some people think that sleeping is just a waste of time. It's 8 hours where you can't be productive or do anything. But we need to start thinking about the fact that it's not just about the rest. It is basically a clean and rinse cycle. The seventh thing that can destroy your brain is chronic stress. And I can't overemphasize this enough. People know about it. They feel stressed. They say, I'm too stressed. They hear that it's a bad thing. They really don't understand what it is or what to do with it. So a lot of people quote specific things, like in terms of things that hurt your brain. They say, well, negative people hurt your brain. They shorten your life, they whatever, or negative news. And all of that is true. But it's all sorts of negativity wherever it comes from. So if you're aware of it, if you pay attention to how you feel and how you react to it, then you can choose to exclude those things or minimize them. Another one is fear. And again, news bring us a lot of fear. They warn us, they tell us about the politics and the war and the economy and all the other things we should be afraid of that make us feel bad. It could also be bills, or it could be uncertainty, what's going to happen. We can have things like overwhelm, feelings of overwhelm. If we have just too many tasks, there's too many things to do, too many deadlines, and never enough time. And some people will mention social isolation. They've said that they've done these studies and they find that people in social isolation have more degradation, more degeneration, and a thinner cortex of their brain and so forth. And all of that is true, but we have to understand that it's not one of these things or another. It is all of them. And the reason is that your brain perceives all of these as threats. And it has everything to do with how you feel. But deep down, there are only two kinds of feelings, two kinds of emotions. And one of them feels good and the other one feels bad. And then we have 1,000 different labels and nuances on it. But it's really just two. Some makes you feel good, something makes you feel bad. And if you can pay attention to how you feel, then you can do something about it. You can be a little objective and you can look at it and you can choose to do something else. So here's what happens. anytime you feel bad for whatever reason, for whatever thing it is that makes you feel threatened, you're going to activate a system in your nervous system, something that tries to keep you alive, that puts on an emergency response because you interpret something as a threat. So first you're going to increase the activity of your HPA axis, which is simply your detection system, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus detects it and it kicks out the response, and then we send out the hormones and the messages to the adrenals so they can respond with cortisol and with adrenaline and save us in that emergency. And the second half of that, which goes parallel, is called the sympathetic activation, which is the actual stress response. And now 3 things happen. And the first is that we increase our levels of cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. It's there to primarily to raise blood sugar so we have more energy for the fight-flight. And cortisol is directly destructive to brain tissue. And when we go through these, we have to realize and remember that chronic stress is not supposed to be there. And I'll talk about that as well. Stress is supposed to be very short term, but we have developed lifestyles and belief systems and societies where we develop chronic stress. We feel these threats 24 hours a day. And now this hippocampus that I mentioned before, that's critical for memory, it has a very high receptor density for cortisol. And again, we're only supposed to have these short term. So with the high receptor density, it's going to take the most damage. And the second thing that happens is we increase inflammation. And we have to understand there's 2 types of immunity. That inflammation is an immune response. And in a fight-flight situation, we get the acute immune response, because if we start bleeding, then we want to start healing and closing that wound as soon as possible. And that's what we need that inflammation for. But then there's a second type of immune response, and that's the cell-based immune response. That's your T cells and your B cells, your immune cells that can go after bacteria and viruses and parasites and so forth. And that one actually gets down-regulated now by chronic stress. So one type of immunity goes up, which we're also only supposed to have short-term. This inflammation is not supposed to go on week after week, year after year. It's supposed to be for healing tissue, and then it goes back to normal. But instead, we end up with chronic inflammation and with a depressed immune system for pathogens. And an additional finding that they have noticed in some research is that with these effects, they've seen a significant cortical thinning, that the superficial layer of the brain is shrinking, where we have all our active brain cells, so to speak. And a third factor that you hardly ever hear about is that with a stress response, we change our focus and we shift our blood flow, our blood supply from the cortex to the brainstem. So when you're calm and you're thinking, or you're reading a book, or you're in a class that you're enjoying and you're learning good stuff, then your brain kind of slows down. It gets into alpha mode between 12 and 15 hertz. And the cortex, the part where you do the thinking, where your awareness is flooded with blood. And you have very good capacity for learning and evaluating. But that type of brain activity is not very productive in a stress response. If you get attacked in a back alley or by a wild animal, or you almost ran over by a bus, then that thinking doesn't help you. You need a quick, reactive, instinctive function. So that's where the blood flow shifts down to your brainstem, where your reflexes live, where your animal instincts reside. So with a stress response, now you're going to shift your blood down, so there's less available for thinking. There's less available for conscience. So if you have chronic stress, then you're basically, a lot of times, you're taking your cortex offline and you're starving the cortex and it shrinks. So there's no quick fix for chronic stress, but you also don't want to just say, oh, well, that's my life. There's nothing I can do about it. Because it's more about your perception, and you can change that. Not today, not over a week, but if you start paying attention and start deciding to feel better, if you notice how you feel and you say, I don't feel good, then decide to change it. And maybe you can change it a little bit today and a little bit more tomorrow. And in a year, you could be completely different, and you could have the same life around you, but it doesn't affect you the same way. And the 8th thing that hurts your brain is a sedentary lifestyle or lack of movement. So after all that talk about stress, we have to talk about some good stress. So the problem with the stress we talked about, the chronic stress, is that when it's chronic, it becomes distress. It breaks you down because it never lets up. Stress is supposed to be very short term and allow for full recovery. So we have too much of the chronic stress, and we don't have enough of the eustress, the good stress that builds you up. So EU is a Greek prefix that means true or good. And by some coincidence, my supplement brand is called Euvexia, which means true wellness, but that's another story. So here, we know that movement and exercise is equal to eustress. It's a positive, it's a constructive, it's a necessary form of stress. It's a challenge for the body that it needs. But unlike the chronic stress, it is short, intense, and acute with full recovery. So it's like a shock to the body. It's a change of state. It's intense, but then we get to calm down and recover. And that's how all animals live their lives. They have short, intense bursts of activity, but then they get to settle down. And we also have to understand the brain's purpose. The brain's purpose is to process information, to process signals. There's incoming information that make the brain work. It processes and it sends signals out. And here's a little known fact that movement provides 90% of the brain's work, of the stimulation that gives the brain a reason to do something. 90% of it has to do with movement, with posture, with position in a field of gravity. And all movement is good. All movement provides signals. However, if we increase the intensity, if we make it really intense and short, now it becomes more of a challenge. And then the body responds to the challenge, and if it's given the chance to repair and recover, now it grows better than it was. And it does this by producing a couple of hormones called human growth hormone and BDNF, stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this BDNF is basically miracle grow for the brain. It's a hormone that makes it possible. These two hormones, actually, human growth hormone and BDNF, they're both necessary for making new synapses. So basically, you make these synapses, these connections. That's how you process information. That's how you learn things. That's how you execute things. And the ones you don't use go away. And then when you do something new, now you make new ones. But you can't do that without these two hormones. So without enough movement, without enough exercise, then your brain is going to have a lack of regeneration. It's not going to be able to repair itself as well. And that's the same thing as atrophy, shrinkage, and an increased risk of dementia. And now we're getting to the really cool stuff. I know you know that these are bad for your brain, but you probably haven't heard of these reasons. And this is fascinating. So smoking and alcohol will destroy your brain and increase your risk of dementia. One thing is the nicotine. It's not so much the smoke. That damages your lungs. It's bad for all sorts of other reasons. But the nicotine causes chronic vasoconstriction. That means the blood vessels tighten up, and especially the peripheral blood flow suffers. And this is why with vasoconstriction and stress, you have cold hands and feet, because you restrict the blood flow to the periphery. But One more place that is peripheral, that is far away from the heart, is your brain. So if you're a chronic smoker and you have chronic vasoconstriction, now you're going to chronically reduce your cerebral blood flow, the blood flow to your brain. And here's another one that hardly anyone talks about. In smoke, in cigarette smoke, there is carbon monoxide that you're breathing in. And do you know how you die from carbon monoxide poisoning? Well, it's because carbon monoxide binds with hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is there to carry oxygen for us. And it binds and it dissociates at a very precise interval. So it can carry it. It holds it tight enough to get it to where it needs to go. But then if there's a little bit less oxygen in that tissue, then it lets go at just the right time. However, carbon monoxide binds 200 to 250 times harder with hemoglobin. So it gets like totally stuck. And therefore, when you smoke, even a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of carbon monoxide is going to stick to that hemoglobin and stay there. So now we have a reduced ability to deliver oxygen because some of it is blocked by carbon dioxide. And the brain is extremely hungry for oxygen. The brain is 2% of your body weight, uses 20 to 25% of all your energy, of all your calories, of all your oxygen, and all your blood flow. So it's not very tolerant for a lack of oxygen and blood. And it doesn't take more than 4 seconds with a complete shutoff of blood to the brain for you to become unconscious. In fact, the brain has developed this ingenious mechanism that's called passing out. And what happens then is if it doesn't get enough blood flow high enough from the heart to the brain, then it makes sure that you pass out so that your head ends up at the same level as your heart so that the blood can start flowing again. But how much does that really matter? Well, if we look at the combined effect of the vasoconstriction, which sends less blood, and the carbon monoxide, which makes less oxygen available per unit blood, if you're a heavy smoker, the combined effect of those could mean that you reduce your oxygen delivery by about 1/3. And that's a huge thing. That means you're walking around with chronic hypoxia because, like I said, the brain is so demanding of energy and oxygen, and it has such a low tolerance because it depends on it so much, it can't decrease very much before it starts suffering. And we need to realize that the brain is a very greedy master. It's incredibly selfish. And why? Because without the brain, nothing else can work. You can't move, you can't survive, you can't act, you can't think. So the brain always comes first. And in fact, the brain will willingly sacrifice body part for its own benefit and for survival. It will shut off the blood flow to anything else if there's a chance that it can survive. And yet, there are people out there, there are heavy smokers who willingly cut off their oxygen supply by 1/3 and create chronic brain starvation. Now, alcohol is the other part of that you also know about. Alcohol is directly neurotoxic to brain tissue, and it primarily targets the white matter, the insulating matter. And alcohol in large amounts can shrink the prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the brain, where you have your humanity, where you have your judgment, where you have your ability for complex thought, for impulse control, and for motivation. So the impulse control is important because the white matter is myelin, and the brain is not fully myelinated before age 25. And this is why teenagers very often are very developed in many ways. They have a capacity for thinking, but they also have very poor impulse control in some cases. But alcohol, in terms of the liver breaking it down, also uses up and depletes a lot of B vitamins, primarily B1 and B12. And those vitamins are essential for myelin synthesis. So first, alcohol breaks down the myelin, and then it prevents the reconstruction of it. So it's both a nutritional and a neurotoxic effect. And another way of looking at it is that smoking and alcohol really works as a team. They really complement each other because alcohol breaks the tissue down, and then the smoking starves the brain and prevents the brain from repairing, because one of the most critical components of repair is obviously energy and blood supply. And number 10 is too much screen time, too much time on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer. And a lot of people have mentioned this, and all you ever hear from them is, yeah, you don't want to expose yourself to too much blue light because it interferes with sleep. And then their story stops there. Well, we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive, and you're going to love this. This is my absolute favorite thing to talk about. We have to think about how the brain is designed. What is it designed for? What kind of world did it operate in before we had all of our modern conveniences and technologies? So a screen is an unnatural focus. We've never had anything like a screen to focus on and spend so much time on, because the brain is designed to be moving about in a world of 3 dimensions. And what happens with 3 dimensions is we have depth, we have texture, we have nuances, we have shading, and we have gravity. So as we're moving around, we're processing all of those and we're creating a picture. And here's one of the most important factors, that as we're moving about, we are performing spatial navigation and we're getting visual input, which matches our physical movement. That is so key, because the brain primarily exists to process movements. We have a brain so that we can move around in our environment and gather food and survive. Things that don't move don't have a brain. And then all the different parts of the brain that process these different kinds of information, they're constantly processing, they're calibrating, and they're rewiring your brain based on what you're experiencing. And this rewiring is called synaptogenesis. If you don't use synapses, they break down and go away. As you have new experiences, you make new synapses so that you're creating a current experience. And watch this. You can only do this rewiring with BDNF. And BDNF is produced by movement and exercise. How cool is that? How smart is that? But what happens to most people who live in front of computers and screens and computer games, the eyes see motion, but there is no movement. There's no body movement to match it. There's no body movement to integrate with what you're seeing. So what's happening is we're replacing this 3-dimensional world that we can move about in with a 2-dimensional flat compression. And we're not activating those spatial circuits. They go unused. All these different areas that we use when we move in 3 dimensions, most of them are not activated. And what they have found with people who spend a lot of time in front of screens for a long period of time is that there's a measurable decrease in the volume of the hippocampus. We're losing so much integration that the brain starts shrinking. And here's another interesting aspect. We're basically forcing a form of tunnel vision. Normally, when you move about, you're switching between central vision and peripheral vision. Between the central uses the fovea and the peripheral vision uses the rest of the retina. And we're constantly moving around. We're switching back and forth between central and periphery, and we're activating all those different areas. We have an increased spatial awareness. But when we're on a screen with tunnel vision and we're not using that peripheral vision, now those circuits go unused and they degenerate. But now here's a fascinating byproduct of that. If we don't use the peripheral vision, and that is typically where we pick up a threat. That's where we know what's going on around us. But now all of a sudden, we lose that awareness. Now we compensate because we have all our focus here. Now we compensate by getting more tense, by increasing our baseline of stress, of our sympathetic activation, because we suspect that there's some threat out there, but we can't see it anymore. So in the three-dimensional world, we are active participants. The brain is receiving multiple inputs, and it's putting all of that together into a complex picture, and it's rewiring and activating all those circuits. So it's a continuous active creation. But the two-dimensional screen is very different because it delivers pre-processed content. It is so well packaged and it's so fast and it stimulates us, but there's very little that we have to do. It doesn't require any active participation. So the brain is highly stimulated without needing to do any constructive work. And the result of that, listen closely to this, is decreased complexity. We're getting fewer circuits involved, so we're reducing the neural density. The brain doesn't have as much to do, so it gets simplified, it gets weaker. And as I've said over and over, use it or lose it. These unused circuits, they go away over time, they degenerate. The brain is only going to keep the things that you use. Now, I don't want you to freak out because computers are wonderful, entertainment is wonderful. We just have to do it in some moderation. We have to have some perspective to it. The brain is absolutely amazing at adapting, and it can certainly handle several hours a day in front of the computer. Just make sure that it's not 16 hours of screen time. There's some people who get up and they go sit at the computer, and the only time they leave is for the bathroom or for a snack. And then at the most, they get 5 minutes of moving into a day. Okay? That balance, the brain cannot handle. It will lose so much of its critical wiring. And maybe you have heard people use the expression, I am who I am. And it usually comes up when someone suggests they change something or they're tempted to make an improvement and they say, I am who I am, I can't change. And I'm here to tell you that from a neurodevelopment, from a neuroplasticity, from a brain perspective, that is just absolutely plain wrong. It doesn't work like that because you are not who you are. You are not who you were last week. You are who you have recreated since last week. So it's all the stuff that you keep doing, and it's because you have the same habits that you keep recreating the same pathways, and that's why you stay who you are. But if you understand that, then you also know that if you keep changing one little thing at a time and you create a little bit of momentum in the direction that you want, now you can recreate pretty much whatever you like. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.